In this video, I'm going to be discussing my top 7 tips and methods for learning a new language. Tip number 1, the 80-20 principle, sometimes referred to as the Pareto principle. The main idea is that some words are more important than others. So 80% of spoken language is made up by like 20% of the words in that language. And so if you just really focus on that 20%, then you're 80% of the way to learning the language. Really focus on words that are super high use. Like, and, or, as, because, what, where, when, why. All of those words are very, very high use. It's like the glue words that put together sentences. Learning a word like tire or astrophysics isn't going to be as useful. Unless, of course, you're like a mechanic or an astrophysicist. Then, for those of you more interested in this idea, Nathaniel Drew made a great video where he talked about how to apply this principle specifically to language learning.
Language is experiential. It is something that is meant to be used. I only learn languages to connect with other people and to understand their way of seeing the world and living life. It is really not about lists of words or tables of conjugation.
Immersion. Here's a clip of the famous linguist Steve Kaufman talking about the immersion method.
As a beginner, we should immerse ourselves in the language. In other words, don't try to master the fine points of grammar up front. You won't remember them. It's going to confuse you. I find that the heavy grammar explanation up front is intimidating because we have no point of reference. We don't know what these grammar explanations are referring to.
The immersion method is the method that children actually use to learn their native languages. There's a big misconception that children learn languages better than adults. In fact, adults, given the same amount of time to learn a new language, learn languages far faster than children. It's just that children don't think about it. When you're a kid, you just like sponge everything up. And so the idea is when you immerse yourself in a language, you force yourself to like sponge everything up. You don't give yourself another option. And so practical ways to do this, the best by far is speaking to native speakers. Find a native speaker and just ask them to only speak to you in your target language, the language that you're trying to learn. So for example, if I was trying to learn Spanish again, I would tell everyone around me who speaks Spanish to only speak to me in Spanish. That way it like forces my brain to like try to make sentences, and it also helps you a lot with comprehension. Just massive amounts of input is the best way to like really solidify language in your head. If you just focus on immersing yourself in a language, it becomes super easy. Once you've been immersed in the language for a while, you start to like pick things up and it becomes much more natural. I recently went to South America for a month, and the month in Bolivia I spent practicing Spanish, I increased my Spanish level like significantly faster, like 10 times faster than I did studying at university. So more practical ways to immerse yourself in the language, especially if you don't have native speakers, these can be useful. Watching Netflix. When you watch Netflix, look for shows in your target language. Music, try to listen to as much music as you can in your language. Listening to music is also a great motivator for learning a language because music is like a piece of culture. And so when you're learning a language, you're gaining the ability to better immerse yourself into like another culture, another group of people. Like if you're learning Japanese, try to listen to Japanese music, and then you'll understand Japanese culture more, and therefore you'll be more motivated to learn Japanese as well as learn it faster. Learn from different places. It's best to diversify your sources of information. Diversify the ways that you study. Some people really like to use flashcards. Some people just really like to go full on in immersion. Some people really like to just practice with native speakers, like from day one. All they do is like speak and listen and speak and listen. I think it's very important to try to do a little bit of everything. Number one, just to try different things and see what works best for you. But also, some things are easier to learn different ways. Everybody learns things differently. And so I do think it's useful to like use Duolingo, use flashcards, immerse yourself, watch Netflix movies. I think that you will have the best time learning a new language if you apply all the methods in this video. It also gives you multiple opportunities to learn things different ways. So for example, doing flashcards may help you with vocabulary, but that vocabulary might not stick until you hear it multiple times in a movie, or something you hear in a movie might not make sense until you study the grammar. Studying the grammar might not make sense until you hear it in conversation. You have to take a holistic approach in terms of like what you're consuming to try to learn. Practice often. In fact, practicing really solidifies what you're trying to learn because you're trying to apply it and use it like in a sentence and communicate with someone in the language. which is like the main goal of learning a language, is to communicate with other people. Putting it to work and communicating with somebody can be a huge motivator when learning a language, because oftentimes when learning a language, you'll make a bunch of progress and you'll feel great, and then bam, you just hit like this wall and you feel like you're not making any progress. You just like can't seem to remember words. The intermediate plateau is a very common term in like language learning, and I think the best way past this is through immersion and practicing. As much as I can, I like to practice with native speakers or people who speak the language that I'm trying to learn. If you learn a new grammar rule, try to speak to a native speaker using that new grammar. If you don't know any native speakers to practice your target language with, there's apps like HelloTalk where you can have online chats and try to chat with people that speak the language you're trying to learn. Be consistent. I think this is a huge one, especially for me. I struggle a lot with consistency. When you're trying to learn any new skill, especially learning a language, which is very complicated, everything's brand new, it's super important to be consistent. Do a little bit every day. I personally think that it's better to at least do 30 minutes of Duolingo a day if you do it every single day compared to like studying for an hour once a week. Because if you think about it, 30 minutes a day, you're getting like 3 hours compared to if you just did like one block of like 1 or 2 hours every week or so. Just be consistent. Read one page of a book or watch one episode of Netflix. Like a lot of low lift things. Just make sure that you're doing something with the language consistently. The repetition of consistency helps things that you're learning stick and like glue into your head a lot better. It also just builds the habit to eventually become fluent in the language that you're trying to learn, or whatever your goal is. Be patient. Learning a new language is very difficult. It's confusing, complicated, a little scary, especially at the start. It takes a long time. Oftentimes people give up. They go to like speak to a native speaker and nothing makes sense and they just stop. Just sticking through and staying consistent with the language and being patient, over time it will come to you. Being patient and being consistent together, you will grow. Know that it won't suck forever. Eventually something will click. Just try different methods. Be consistent. Practice often. Use multiple sources of information. Do all the previous steps and just be patient. Eventually it'll click and eventually your skills will grow. It took me like a 1.5 years to be like what I would consider fluent in Spanish. And the first 6 months I had like a huge jump in terms of like my ability to speak. And it took me another like 8 months until I started to make significant growth again. I had to just have massive amounts of input. If you immerse yourself in a language consistently, there's no language that you can't learn within like 3 to 5 years. The only way to increase the speed is to have massive input and speak with native speakers as much as possible. So like moving to a foreign country or marrying someone who speaks a language you're trying to learn. That's not possible for everybody though. So my advice is to just be patient and try to do everything that I mentioned before. The last tip, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Learning a language is difficult, it's very complicated, and it's super rewarding. You get to increase the amount of people that you can speak to. You get access to new culture, to new foods, to new people, new friends, new experiences, new stories, all by learning a language. I think that learning a new language is beautiful. If you made it this far into the video and you actually want to learn a new language, I commend you and I hope that you stick with it. But I know from personal experience, it's very difficult to start speaking to people. When you start to learn a new language and you go to speak to people who speak that language, you sound like a kid because you have like the knowledge of a kid. And so you sound like a toddler running around speaking like broken Chinese or like broken French or whatever. It doesn't feel great and people may laugh at you. I think it's best to laugh with them, because what you're saying is funny. You have to just be okay with making mistakes, know that you will make mistakes, and know that it's okay to make mistakes because you're trying and you're learning. A lot of the big jumps I've made have been from making mistakes. Just like the guilt and embarrassment sometimes that you get from making mistakes in front of people, especially crowds of people, it really makes it stick in your head when you get corrected. In my mind, every mistake you make is an opportunity to learn. And I think that applies to not just languages, but life, but especially in language learning where especially the start is very embarrassing. Just really be okay with putting yourself out there, because the quicker you put yourself out there and start practicing and speaking, and the more you immerse yourself, the quicker you learn the language. Hopefully you got something out of this, especially if you're going into the new year trying to learn a new language. I really hope you stick with it, and I hope these tips were useful.